Good evening and welcome to the School of Visual Arts and to the Design Criticism MFA programme. I'm Alice Twemlow, I'm the chair of the programme, and it's great to see you all tonight. I look forward to meeting you and chatting with you further after the lecture over drinks and snacks in the other room. So please do stick around for that afterwards. It's a really good part of the evening, actually. What this tonight's event is in fact the first of the spring lecture series, which has been carefully curated by the first year students in the programme. I work with them to come up with a list of exciting speakers who both complement our curriculum and in some ways kind of challenge it. I think often the names that come up are ones which students perhaps feel are missing from the curriculum that we teach here, or would somehow provide a provocation to the things we present in our daily fare. So I always find this especially exciting. As you can see, it spans a whole spectrum. The names they've selected span that whole spectrum, from satire to storytelling and from play to politics. I'm looking forward to each and every one of them. So please do join us for these lectures. And if you've missed ones in the past that you think look interesting, that you see mentioned on our website, pretty much all of them we video and post online on our own Vimeo site, so you can check that out. So it's my pleasure to bring one of our first year's students to the stage tonight to host the event. That's part of the deal. So, and also if you come to any more of these events during the spring, you're going to be witness to a whole plethora of interesting accents, and that's the case for tonight also. We'll be hearing New Zealand accent featured this evening. So please welcome to the podium, all the way from New Zealand via Decrit, Catherine Roberts.
So, good evening and welcome. I'm Catherine Roberts, and as Alice said, I'm a first year student here at Decrit. So, news moves fast. And these days it seems like there's more of it than ever before. The news cycle is constant, it's unrelenting, and it's overwhelming, to say the least. I can't even count how many times a day I check Twitter for new news, and I know that I'm not the only one. So amid constant pressure to be in the know, on top of the breaking news and at the cutting edge, there's a new breed of online publication that's starting to occur. And Narratively is one of these. Posting only one story a day, 5 stories a week, they're embracing a slow news cycle. Now, no stranger to news cycles and storytelling, having produced work for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and CBS News, just to name a few, Noah Rosenberg knows news and how to tell stories. Now, as an emerging design critic myself with a keen interest in publications, I've been keeping a close eye on Narratively. So when we were discussing possible speakers for this series, I knew who I wanted. When Noah responded with an enthusiastic yes, I was, and still am, very excited. And from the looks of all of you, you are as well. So please join me in welcoming the founder and editor of Narratively, Noah Rosenberg.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you for having me, Catherine and SVA. There we go. Thank you. So I wanted to start things off by just asking you guys a quick few questions. They're pretty easy questions, so don't be afraid. How many of you guys are on Facebook in the room here? Don't be shy. Raise the hands if you're on Facebook. All right. So pretty much all you guys. How many of you have more than, at least 300 friends on Facebook? 800 friends? 1,000 friends? So I mean, we're still talking most of the room here. So the idea basically is that we're bombarded with information all the time. Through our social media feeds, we're constantly getting invitations to ska bands from people we don't even know, pictures of our friends' new babies, and I'm sure the same thing's true for you guys on Twitter. you're getting information all the time through social media, and it's unmanageable. The irony here is that I was just stuck on the subway for 20 minutes getting here, and I didn't have any access to information, and I needed to get them and tell SVA that I actually was coming, and it was pretty difficult and very stressful. But when you don't need that information, it's always at you, and it's overwhelming in a way. I think at the same time, though, there's been a push in recent years away from this whole 24/7 news cycle and this constant flow of information. There's been a big stress toward more original, in-depth stories, more thoughtful stories. And I bet if I asked all you guys if there's one piece of content that you've stumbled upon in the past couple months, something might pop into your mind, beyond just kind of, puppy photos and a breaking news story about a horrible massacre or a flood or something. Anybody have a story that's really captivated you in the past, month or so that you remember? Anybody have something you want to share? Yeah, you in the back. What was the story, and why do you remember it still a month or so later?
The Taco Bell announced that they were going to have a logo taco that was Cool Ranch flavored. I thought that was intriguing because I was surprised at the success of the nacho cheese flavored one, and so I want to try it.
So Taco Bell announced a taco flavored nacho?
No, it's a Cool Ranch Dorito flavored taco shell.
Oh wow, okay. A Cool Ranch Dorito flavored taco shell. All right, so it's not quite helping my point here, but you're getting there. Well, I have a story that I just really captivated me. Not quite tacos, but it's pretty cool nonetheless. Some of you guys might recognize this. It was a really beautiful New York Times project called Snowfall. I think it was about a month and a half ago at this point, and the irony was that here was a project that the Times had spent, over a year on. You're talking teams of developers, engineers, of course, journalists and photographers and multimedia reporters. But yet this story wasn't about news. It ended up in the news cycle. People were talking about this like it was the cure-all for long-form journalism. This was going to save the day. And then, of course, the naysayers were saying, no, that's not the case at all. It's not sustainable. It took a team of dozens of people to produce this thing. But if you're not familiar with it, check it out. You can just Google the word Snowfall. You'll find it. It was a really wonderful piece, really dramatic, 6,000 or 8,000 word story in 5 or 6 parts about a fatal avalanche out in the West sometime last year. But the really cool thing is that, as you can see here, the designers integrated. It doesn't seem to be moving there, but it was moving. There's moving video and embedded little multimedia nuggets throughout the piece. There are other outlets, of course, that are doing similar work. A couple come to mind you guys might have heard of. The Atavist is doing really phenomenal, kind of, they call them sort of mid-length multimedia enhanced long-form pieces. Byliner is doing some fantastic work. Kindle Singles, of course, perennial powerhouses like The New Yorker. The list goes on forever. The problem is that a lot of this content is focused on these big international stories, these stories of intrigue and murder and scandal and you name it. There's not enough happening right in our own backyards. There's so many stories to tell in this city and other cities that we're overlooking because we're focusing on the next big thing. And that was an opportunity we saw in creating Narratively. So as Catherine was mentioning, we launched Narratively in September of this year after a successful Kickstarter campaign. Kickstarter, by the way, a fantastic platform for anybody who has a creative endeavor. For us, it was basically market research. It obviously got the idea out there, raised some money in the process, but fantastic way for us to kind of test this theory that we have that people wanted an outlet for so-called slow journalism or slow storytelling. So the model here is that we're a platform for original, true, and in-depth stories about New York, and we're planning to expand to different cities in a few weeks. So we accomplish this by focusing on just one theme a week. So this week's theme from this screenshot rather, is Drifters. So we explored the waterfront in New York City, ranging from stories on tugboat captains to a photo essay on life through a porthole in New York Harbor, to stories, kind of a nostalgic reflection of life aboard the Staten Island ferry. We've done weeks on the flip side of food, behind the scenes in the food industry in New York City. We did a week called How We Die, about the logistics of death and dying in New York. But I can't stress enough that these are stories that couldn't be farther away from the news cycle. These are stories that have nothing to do with breaking news. You're not going to see these stories on the front page of a New York Times or at the top of an evening newscast on CBS. These are stories that enlighten you, that will kind of inform your sense of what it means to be a New Yorker or what it means to be a San Franciscan if we get to that point down the road with other cities. But these are stories that are not at all part of the news cycle. And there are some challenges when you do that sort of thing. I mean, we're expanding now. We have, we benefit from a fantastic community. Filmmakers and writers and photographers in the New York area, illustrators who have worked for some of the top outlets around, who have come to us because we're a platform for this type of storytelling that they couldn't really sell or do elsewhere. You'd probably be hard pressed to pitch successfully a 4,000-word piece on a tugboat captain to the Times Metro section. There'd have to be a reason for that, and the Times has an obligation to tell the news and to inform you. And we're sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, where we're obviously informing you, but you're not making your stock market decisions off of our content. These are leisure readings. So it's tough though when you don't sort of play the game, so to speak, and you're not involved in the news cycle. How do you stay relevant? It's a question that has kind of bogged a lot of people for a long time. As you'll see in this clip I'm about to show you, really this story takes place in New York City, but it very well could take place anywhere. This is a story that really gets at the heart of kind of a scientific truth. You'll see it's about a woman with a very, very interesting neurological condition. And this story might as well take place in Berlin or Abu Dhabi or somewhere else. And so that's one of the cool things about us, but it's also a challenge, which I'll get into a little bit later. Is there any chance should we dim the lights, or should I just step back and play this thing? I guess it's... Thanks. That's fine.
I remember I was a little girl. If I close my eyes, I can almost see it now. I thought it was part of the environment. I would hear a sound and a flash of light would go by, or these beautiful shapes would drift in my field of vision. I would want them. They were beautiful. I wanted to hold them and examine them more closely, and I would reach for them, and my hands would be empty. And so I quickly discovered as a child that what I was experiencing was here, but not quite here. So it was this nether world where something is there, but it's not really there at all. I'm Maureen Seberg. I'm a New York City-based author, and I'm a synesthete. A synesthete is a person who experiences a blending of the senses. It's clearly real, and I'm very grateful for modern neuroscientists who have proven this using brain imaging machines. When they stimulate one sense of a synesthete and look into their brain, they're clearly seeing two responses in two different areas of the brain. So for example, if you were to flash me the number 6 on a flashcard while I was in such a machine, I would see the color green. A more technical way to put it is that one sensory input yields a second sensory response. So for example, if I'm listening to Yo-Yo Ma playing Bach's Prelude in G, I will hear the music. Synesthesia does not replace the primary sense. I'm hearing it just as you would. But I'm also seeing these beautiful molten glass-like shapes in a coffee color that fold over each other like waves. I'm surrounded by it at all times, but unlike someone experiencing this through hallucinogens, I'm still grounded in reality and realizing that this is some sort of overlay to my experience. I am a child of the 60s too, so imagine all this chemically induced synesthesia going on all around me and everyone fascinated with it. And I'm naturally trippy, and no one knows what's going on with me. I am proud to tell you this is the same zip code as the Wu-Tang Clan. 10304. S-I-N-Y, Shaolin. I came from very straight parents who were far from being hippies. My father is a hero New York City police officer. And things were very authoritarian in my household and not part of the counterculture whatsoever. And yet here I am, this little girl, tripping through these experiences quite naturally and having nowhere to turn to talk about it. I think some of the fears about speaking of the unusual experiences that synesthetes have are well grounded. There are reports from synesthesia advocacy organizations of young children who are being medicated in the wrong way, who are perceived to be hallucinating. And the important thing for people to know about synesthesia, even though I'm describing things that sound so unreal in many regards, and I'm aware of that, we are very much grounded in reality. We're highly functioning people. In fact, synesthesia is on the autism spectrum, so it's as though we're highly functional autistic people in some regard. As if synesthesia weren't esoteric enough and metaphysical in nature, there seems to be a connection between synesthesia and both the near-death experience and the out-of-body experience. And the truth of the matter is, I've had them since I was a small child. If I close my eyes now, I can still see one of the earliest out-of-body experiences I had. I gently lifted out of my body and up into the air of my bedroom. I went out the window and over my backyard. And I looked around and I saw the glow of Manhattan north of me, and I just headed there. And I loved to play there like a Wendy in a Metropolitan Peter Pan. And even today, I come up out of the subway in Times Square, and I'm reminded of those experiences. Synesthetes are coming out of the closet more and more, and some of the famous synesthetes who've been talking about their impressions include Kanye West, Lady Gaga, the designer Iris Van Herpen, the actress Tilda Swinton, Itzhak Perlman, the great violinist. Many other people are experiencing it and talking about it. Even though the stigma is being lessened, it's still difficult to talk about synesthesia with people who don't experience it. I remember interviewing Billy Joel for my first book. He is a synesthete, and I thought it was very brave of him to talk with me because he said, I don't want to get too clinical about it, lest the sorcery disappear. So it's like any sort of unusual experience that you have alone. Somehow speaking of it doesn't quite capture it. You can only try to form the words that will best describe it.
Thanks for checking that out, guys. So I might be a bit of a nerd when it comes to this kind of thing, but that, the different types of storytelling that were in that piece, the little projections, the kind of the paper puppets and things like that. We have a lot of room at Narratively to get creative when it comes to presenting these stories. Throughout any given week, with our one theme a week approach, we're exploring one story a day in what we like to say is the most appropriate medium. So Monday might yield a long form, magazine style narrative. Tuesday, a short film. Wednesday, some sort of photo essay or illustration. And the list goes on. And I think Narratively was born of kind of a yearning, an idea, a need that I had a couple of years ago. It was probably around 2008. At the time, I was working for a chain of weekly newspapers in Queens as a digital director. I'd worked at CBS News for a while before then. And I was starting to see newspaper outlets and legacy media companies just collapsing all around me. Thinking, oh my God, this type of storytelling I love to do, this human interest storytelling, kind of traveling to the far corners of New York City and swimming with the Polar Bear Club on New Year's Day, or going to some little Italian neighborhood and kind of celebrating with them and documenting it as Italy won the World Cup and these Italian statuettes were raised in this little teeny street. And I was afraid that this type of story would continue to get thrown by the wayside as newspapers and other outlets were cutting back. So saw the opportunity, went on with my career. As Catherine mentioned in the introduction, I worked for the New York Times for about 2 years as a full-time freelancer, some other outlets here and there. But started kind of, building the idea, and eventually by late 2010, started assembling a team. And it's really grown, rather organically, and I'm proud to say we have a community now of about 200 people in New York who are illustrators and filmmakers and really at the top of their game, but they come to us, even though we're not paying that well right now, we're just getting the business model off the ground, which I can talk to you guys about a bit later. But like I said before, we're this outlet for a certain type of storytelling that you really, necessarily can't do anywhere else or in too many places. This really intense kind of 360-degree view at a local story that resonates beyond that particular city because it's getting at some of these greater truths. But the truth of it is that, there's a lot of competition out there. Outlets like BuzzFeed, for instance, they've really perfected the game of giving you this kind of clickbait. It's almost like we're gerbils, and we hit a little bar and get a little pellet of food or water every few minutes, and we keep coming back. 20 people that are doing it wrong. Did Bill Cosby used to be a hottie? These are things that people click on. So I often talk about, when it comes to narratively and kind of increasing the engagement of our audience and getting people to come back and stay on the site and so forth. I often use the verb to BuzzFeedify. We need to BuzzFeedify narratively a bit, obviously maintaining, our sensibility and the aesthetic and really the idea that there are so many untold stories out there that deserve to be told, but at the same time, incorporating some functionality, whether it's, one thing we're talking about now is doing sort of a quick read, almost like a Huffington Post type thing, where you go onto HuffPo and they have these, most of the stories are not nearly as long as ours are, but they'll give you a little kind of paragraph-long synopsis of that piece, and it's a way for you to say, okay, here's what the gist is, but if I want to come back later, I can save this. And so we're exploring different options, we launched a blog just this week where we're kind of posting updates throughout the week, behind-the-scenes reflections and that sort of thing. But everywhere you go on the web these days, you see this sort of thing where we kind of fall into this trap. Either it's clickbait or the news cycle becomes this kind of echo chamber where everyone's repeating the other person, and it's tough to compete. I'm very proud of where we are so far, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I didn't want to be better, and I didn't want to kind of steal some viewers from BuzzFeed who might want to sleep well at night and feel good about themselves for checking out our stories. And on top of that, if you want to compete with all the kitty, the cute kitty photos out there, it gets a little difficult. This is actually my cat. He's very upset about the whole decline of news and journalism. But like I was mentioning before, it is a challenge to stay relevant in the news cycle. A few things we try, since we are doing these stories that are so far out of the realm. One thing is, even if our individual pieces aren't a news item themselves, we'll do a whole week around a specific event or a time of year. So we have a week coming up over Valentine's Day, actually, a week of sort of matchmaking stories, under the radar, matchmakers in Flushing, Queens, and people writing, interesting essays about their experiences dating and that sort of thing. And that's a way for us to kind of continue our craft and continue these sort of, spotlighting these important stories, but somehow make it so it's relevant and people want to blog about it and pick it up because we're doing it at a certain time of year. Hurricane Sandy, on the other hand, was sort of the kind of climax of this existential crisis that we had. Obviously, we had a great community of contributors ready to mobilize and cover Hurricane Sandy when it hit. And it was a big challenge we thought long and hard about. Do we cover Sandy? Do we leverage all these wonderful journalists we have on staff and get them to go out there and continue to report? And the final decision ended up being, everyone and their cousin is covering Sandy right now. Everyone is around the clock. Unfortunately, the one time of year where these sort of human interest stories that I love so much take a front seat is when disasters happen, and everyone wants to write about John Smith and how humanize the story via these horrible situations and characters. And we realized that this would continue to happen for a while. This news cycle would eventually play out. Of course, we'd continue to hear about Sandy, as we well should, over the course of 6 or 8 or however many months. But until that year-long anniversary came up on the end of October 2013, we'd probably see a lull in the coverage from the spring on. So we decided that we would, using our kind of narratively voice, we would continue to follow some really important stories for several months. And we're actually planning to launch next week a whole week of Sandy stories. So obviously you still see a decent amount of coverage in media, but a lot of these are kind of parachuting stories where people jump into a scene, kind of what's the update since we were last here 2 months ago, whereas our stories coming up next week will be stories that we've followed for 4 months to this point. Other things we do to kind of stay relevant, I mentioned the blog to you. We're enlisting other people from our community to kind of blog on our behalf and talk about stories, even if it's not about narratively stories, kind of really run with these themes we do each week and get them to kind of leverage their own communities and engage their own followers in terms of sharing their perspectives on these particular themes. This is a screenshot from our ebook that we're putting out. We actually just put out our first ebook using the Atavis software actually about a month ago. We've reached a new time, obviously, where everyone has a different platform. We want content the way we want it. We can't expect to kind of stop in our tracks and read a 6,000-word narratively story in the middle of the day. People want to be able to engage with that story, on their own terms, whether it's via an iPhone or an iPad or their desktop or even a print edition at some point. So these are things we're trying to do. We're also in the midst right now of rolling out our live event series, which will be an extension of the stories we're doing, so a way to bring our characters on stage for live storytelling, for panel discussions around the core topics we're covering, film screenings, maybe art gallery shows of our photography and illustrations, and so forth. So we're doing what we can. We're always open for ideas. And I think we've started in recent weeks publishing some shorter pieces too, because like I said, we can't expect people to want to stop in the middle of what they're doing and read an epic 6,000-word story. To us, a short story is still 2,000 words. For those of you who think in terms of word count, that's still a pretty long story. I mean, in all my years working for the New York Times as a freelancer, I think the longest feature I ever did was 1,200 words or 1,300 words. So we're still going in depth, but we're trying to give people a variety of ways to consume the stories. Wanted to kind of maybe talk a bit about the business model a little bit, since maybe some of you are interested in that. I know obviously the variety of our stories range. We're based here in New York. We're telling these sort of New York narratives, and then in the coming weeks we'll be telling narratives from other cities as well. One story a week from an LA or a Saigon or a Paris or a Berlin. We've gotten a lot of support from communities outside of New York because I'd said these stories resonate, and it's sort of a way to test the water, see if there is interest for narratively in other places as well. But since we're not a specific niche, we're sort of a general interest publication. A lot of what we do kind of delves into some of the stuff that you guys do here at Decrit. Stories in the built environment. A tour along the urban decay beside the Newtown Creek. Stories of people journeying underground into forgotten subway tunnels and following old stream beds that used to trickle with water and now have sewage running through them in the West Village. Stories about art and design, and we did a piece on art handlers and kind of these sort of unsung heroes that work behind the scenes to hang the art in the galleries and museums around New York and, of course, other cities. So we're not a niche. We're not doing a golf publication, so there's not like we're going to have, Nike come and sponsor us for the rest of our lives. There are, a few different revenue streams we're working on right now. I won't go into it too deeply, and if anybody has questions afterwards, you can talk to me about it, or maybe, in the Q&A. But on the one hand, we are talking to various advertisers now and sponsors, and that was an easy decision to make. Some people might be concerned that the audience would be turned off by ads. We found quite the opposite. People want us to be sustainable. They want us to continue doing this sort of content, so they fully recognize that we have a need. And granted, we're trying to partner with advertisers and brands that are kind of like-minded, artistically inclined, creatively minded, that want to support us and kind of believe in our mission and want to engage with our audience. So we're doing these sort of exclusive advertising relationships where, the MoMA, for instance, that's just a random example here, they can come and brand out narratively for the course of a week or a month. On top of that, the live events I talked to you about will be ticketed and sponsored. We're also offering a yearly membership, so people who love the content, want to get involved with the community, can pay $30 a year and get a monthly ebook, free access to our live events, hopefully discounts to other cultural institutions and museums and restaurants and things like that in New York. And we're looking for more ideas, more ways to kind of roll some value and make it meaningful to people to become members. Those ebooks we're creating for the membership, we're also selling a la carte on the website. And we're also doing something I'm really excited about. We've been approached by a couple other publishers and brands that are interested in the narratively community of content producers. Our content per se isn't right for them, but they're interested in having us produce stories for them. Whether they're a law journal for, or a car magazine or whatever it is. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity because we have this great community of people that we need to give higher paying work to, and while we're figuring our own business model out, if we can give them higher paying work, it's kind of a win-win. We're doing live, kind of workshops, storytelling workshops that we're trying to roll out right now. Working on deals with TV production companies where we might turn some of our stories into series and documentaries and films and things like that. And then we're syndicating our stories as well. I mean, this kind of goes back to the core mission for starting narratively was, we think we're filling this void. We're creating a type of story that isn't necessarily being produced enough or as often right now as it should. So we're hoping to syndicate and license these stories to other outlets. We've done a bit of that so far, and that's something we'll be ramping up kind of in the coming weeks. There's a few other things I'm working on. As you can tell, we're throwing a bunch of balls in the air right now and seeing what sticks. We're small and agile, so we can do that. And then, if you talk to me in 3 months, we'll probably have something totally different to say and be working in a totally different direction. But, really, it's anything we can do to kind of continue doing the type of content we can and want to do, and that people seem to be responsive to. Wanted to kind of, wrap things up a little bit with another clip. This is much shorter. And again, I think it really kind of captures the spirit of what we're all about, of spotlighting these people that are kind of toiling behind the scenes, that really embody what it means to be a New Yorker and wouldn't necessarily get the attention otherwise.
Most people are attracted to clocks because of the face, the dial, the hands, that tell something. I've often wondered what produces this visceral attraction in clock lovers, and of course the fact that it's a live thing. So in the antiques world, a clock is a unique thing. And you can see that by the clocks in my workshop. It's a weird mixture of the good, the bad, the ugly, the new, the not so new, and the very, very old. Now, the really very old tend to look much nicer and last longer and be of considerable interest to me. And I'm very glad to have the stream of clocks I work on occasionally spiced by something. That makes life worthwhile for me, repairing the occasional really antique clock. But we have to restore what we're given. We can't pick and choose. So not only do I get the clocks running, I also transfigure their external appearance. Old school is leave it looking decrepit and old and squalid. New school is try and restore it back to something like its maker intended it. I'm of the new school in that regard. I clean the ormolu mounts, I remove grease from the case, I get a kick out of that, even if it's just cleaning the glass. Unless I get the impression that the owner considers the muck to be sacred. No one, for example, would congratulate me if I put the Turin shroud through a dry cleaning and got rid of all those stains. And for some people, stains are important. I take the clock to bits. I put it in the ultrasonic cleaning tank, which has a solution of dilute ammonia in water. And then I rinse the parts with hot water and then dry them in a drying tank, which is like a hairdryer within a box. Now they're sparkly and clean again. This is German clockworks that come out of an oak wall-hanging case, and the pendulum would dangle down below and be seen through a glass. Instead of minute markings here, we have 24-hour markings. The French and the Germans use the 24-hour system in all kinds of ways, far more than they did in England or America. So that's the first clue about that. Then if we turn it round, we can see it has two sets of hammers here that play chiming rods, and they're struck by leather-filled brass hammer heads, rather like pencil eraser heads. The clock itself is in very good shape, but the hands were dropping down. So I've tightened up the friction drive mechanism that keeps the hands running properly. That's all I had to do. Reasonably good quality item. Middle range, and that would have been afforded by prosperous middle-class people somewhere in Germany. The only clocks I reject are mass-produced post-war cuckoo clocks, because I value my sanity too highly to get mixed up with those things. Oddly enough, New York itself wasn't a clockmaking center. New Jersey was. It made them very well in the 18th century, very stylishly. Look. John Metcalf. Well, hello there, how are you? At last, yes. Oh, it took about a week and a half. Mind-bending, really. Everybody was out. That was the only consolation.
So that's a really good example, I think, of the types of stories that we cover. Here's a guy who's been laboring away on Wall Street for decades, and under our own noses we might never find otherwise. At the same time, we'll do profiles like this. We'll do kind of some harder hitting things. We had a big piece, one of our first week actually a few months ago, kind of an intimate look at assisted suicide in New York. We did a piece that same week on Hart Island, which is a mass burial site off the tip of the Bronx. That I forget the exact figure, so I'm not even gonna try. But hundreds of thousands of bodies are buried off the coast of the Bronx in this little teeny island that's become sort of a potter's field for unclaimed bodies. And generations of mothers have tried to go out there, trying to visit their deceased children. And you're not allowed on the island unless you work on Rikers, unless you're a prisoner who takes care of the gravestone. So there's so many stories like that in this city, and then if you multiply that times, how many cities are there in the world? Every city's got so many stories to tell. So really, our goal in terms of growing narratively is to kind of really prove the model here in New York. Some people think we're crazy, such a crowded media landscape in New York City, but the fact is no one's really doing this type of work that we think is important. I hope some people do as well. We're getting a good response on that, but the verdict's still out. But I think, the truth is we're going to continue to be doing this, and hopefully we'll come to a city near you, wherever you're from, in the coming weeks and months, and kind of take it from there. But we always welcome feedback. My email is on this next slide, so feel free to contact me if you guys ever have questions or concerns or criticism, ideas. We're always looking for contributors. Even if you guys don't fancy yourselves a writer, or you never know, I mean, we might be looking for essays that you can write, or there's a way to get involved. Of course, we're always looking for story pitches too. If you know a great character in your neighborhood or in your hometown that we should be looking at, send us a line. We'll definitely, there's no such thing as a bad idea, we always like to say. And there's a whole process we go through, which I can get into maybe during the Q&A, about how we look for certain characters and what we look for in certain stories. But at the end of the day, we're all about kind of, at least taking a new angle on something, shedding some new light, and informing people in a new way, and kind of really just playing up their curiosities. So thank you very much.
We've got a little multi-moderated Q&A going on here. So we're going to take a seat. Fantastic, eh? Do you need water at this point? Or
I'm okay, yeah.
Okay.
I talk a lot, so I get a dry mouth sometimes. But,
But seriously, we can go.
No, I'm okay, it's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Very good.
Oh, yes.
Thanks. First, I would just like to start out by thanking you for playing the clock clip. My absolute favorite so far.
Favorite piece we've ever done, actually.
Oh man, it's so great. So what I'd like to start with is basically what you finished on there. What are you looking for in a story when you guys are searching for them?
So thankfully, we get a lot of pitches, which is great. I mean, we wouldn't have any stories if people didn't generate ideas. In terms of our editorial process, the stories start in a number of ways. I mean, oftentimes, I'll have an idea, or someone will have an idea and say, hey, there's this guy named John Metcalf who's a horologist, a master clock repairman who's been working down on Wall Street for generations. Go check it out. Of course, one thing we'll do is say, okay, A, has this guy been covered before? What is new? If the story's been told, it's not a deal breaker. Obviously, there usually is a new way into a story, a kind of a fresh perspective that hasn't been addressed before. But one thing we do is say, okay, what sort of coverage has this idea been, gotten in the past? And then really, who are the characters? What's the underarching, overarching narrative that kind of brings this whole saga together? In the case of Hart Island, that mass burial site I mentioned to you, in some sense of the word, the island itself was a character. This was this sort of kind of eternal thing that was unattainable, unapproachable. Generations of parents and had wanted to get on the island and were unable to because it was off limits to civilians. Artists had kind of observed this island for so long and taken photos and done watercolors of it. And oftentimes there are many different characters in the piece, and it's really, what are some of the kind of the central characteristics of this person that we really want to kind of drive home through quotes and through kind of character development in the story. So it's it's a range. And other times, we'll some of our actually my favorite stories we've done so far have been stories that someone pitched us and said, hey, I've been working on this piece for 6 years or 4 years, whatever it is. I can't find a home for it. I think it's a great fit for narratively. We'll take a look. Oftentimes it is a good fit for us. It's not ready to go right away. We'll, of course, have to update the piece and edit it and work with the writer, over the course of several months to perfect it. But those stories are great because you have the gift of time. I talked before about kind of parachuting in. Sometimes people parachute into a story and then kind of come back on the year anniversary. Well, if you're working on something for 6 years, you have that kind of gift of kind of going in and out of that story and seeing how the story itself and how the characters have changed over the course of several months or several years. Other times, one of our contributing editors had a meeting last night. I wasn't allowed to go because of my gender, but it was a meeting for women, women journalists in New York, because they're planning a week on women. And so this started with an idea. Hey, let's do a week about women. Of course, it'll get more specific as time goes on. They'll develop ideas. But so other times we start a whole week of narrative with just a theme concept and then build stories off of that. And our stories really are like puzzle pieces. Not every story is could the story we did on the tugboat captain have also fit into, a week about, old-time New Yorkers or about, kind of forgotten trades? There are many ways we can kind of, mix and match the stories. And who knows, maybe down the road, when we have a membership going, we can allow you to kind of mix and match and create your own kind of themes based on our stories, which could be pretty cool, I think.
I think it's sort of following on from that. Oh, don't worry, leave it with me. It's about truth. And you advertise your on the site. You know, you're telling stories in long form, obviously, but also true stories. That's a big thing for you. So I wonder if you can tell us how you go about determining the truth, vetting the truth, and why that's obviously so important.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, you know, obviously we don't. So you can get an idea of kind of the size of the operation. I mean, you know, I'm working on this full time. Brendan Spiegel, who's our wonderful managing editor, is kind of working on this full time. We have a team of contributing editors who are kind of, you know, doing part time, and you know, a lot's getting onto their plates as time goes on. And we have, you know, people helping on the business side, and you have lots of people kind of working on stories. But you know, there's you know, kind of a range of commitment levels and a range of different people who are working on things. And I already forgot what the initial question was. What was?
Oh, about how you go about verifying the truth.
Yes. Okay. The whole long-winded point of that was, despite, you know, the numbers, we don't have kind of a huge fact-checking department. You know, we're not the New Yorker magazine. We're not New York Magazine. So, you know, it's tough. I mean, a lot of it at the end of the day comes down to just trusting kind of, you know, your instincts as an editor, you know, making sure you're trusting the writers, kind of, you know, checking on their pedigree, checking on kind of clips they've done in the past. You know, of course, as we're writing things, or excuse me, as we're editing things, you know, we're also fact-checking. We're searching for people's names, making sure names are spelled right. We're talking with subjects in some cases. Thank you very much. But I mean, I think, you know, even when you're working for a big news outlet, you know, you know, when you're on tight deadline, they're not checking every fact, and that's why people get burned sometimes. I mean, you hear these horror stories about people making up characters, and you know, you do as much as you can, but you know, a lot of times, you know, these are people that are you know, telling New York stories right in New York, and because of that, you know, there's a sense of trust there, and understanding that, you know, they're going to be doing the story justice. You know, this person they're writing about could be their neighbor or the person down the block, and they're going to do their best to kind of make sure that that story is factually accurate and kind of maintain their integrity as a writer. Because at the end of the day, it reflects on us, you know, poorly or you know, well, regardless, you know, depending on how the story comes out.
Well, I can follow up on that while you're thinking, which was really, I found it fascinating how eloquent the synesthete was, and admittedly she was a writer, so that's probably the reason in that case. But I wondered if you help people who are telling their own stories like that to craft and script their stories, or was that just great?
Yeah. So I mean, I wasn't there, you know, when they filmed that piece, but I did work with them in terms of kind of some edits after the fact, and of course we had. So that story, actually, like many of our stories, had originated from a contact. You know, we had been thinking about this week of kind of exploring senses in New York City, and this overwhelming place that never sleeps. You know, lights everywhere, and subway, you know, sounds, etc. You know, what's it like to kind of be missing a sense, or you know, what does it mean? You know, kind of what's the sort of kind of carnival of the senses that we're subjected to in New York all the time? And so one of our contributors actually said, "Oh, well, I know this person who has this condition," and of course that happens all the time. You know, they always pan out. I mean, you know, we were joking for a long time. Someone for months had told us they knew someone who had fallen, hit in their head, and the last thing they had eaten before that injury had been lasagna, and now everything tastes like lasagna to them. And we're like, oh my God, it's a fantastic story. We have to find this person. Of course, they didn't. You know, who knew where this person was, if they ever even existed? But it became this sort of story in our contributors meetings. Hey, we have to find this. It's the story of a lifetime. Yeah, I mean, it's a great story, right? I mean, maybe someone should write a novel about it because we couldn't find the real person. So that's one of those kind of fact-checking type things where, okay, we need a subject to write a story off of. With this type of piece, you know, much like for a written article, you're sitting down, you're interviewing the person, you're asking them questions that, you know, I guess in some sense of the word, you are shaping, you know, their dialogue based on what you're asking them. And if, you know, so, you know, I mean, for instance, you know, I mean, even just getting someone to talk, for instance, there was no narrator in this piece. So you want to make sure you're getting, you know, full sound bites that you can kind of edit together to create a narrative. So, you know, what's your name? You know, don't just say your name, say my name is. So get them to repeat the question, you get them talking about, you know, what it means to have this condition, how they see the world, and you kind of, you keep asking questions in a way, and which is easy for us because that's what we do. We're storytellers, and we talk a lot and ask questions. But you kind of, you know, you have sort of an end goal of, okay, I want this person to talk about X, Y, and Z, and I kind of shift and kind of, you know, ask different questions in order to kind of channel the conversation in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, beautifully
So.
seamless.
Yeah.
Now, you don't have a fact checker on staff, but you do have a photo editor, I noticed, and I thought that's a pretty interesting decision. You obviously really value that
Yeah. So, I want to be clear that, we might not have sort of an official person designated as fact checker, but, we take, facts and very, very carefully and seriously, and each of our pieces goes through about 4 different people before it goes to press. And, the last, of course, throughout the process, we're obviously editing the piece and sending the writer back to find more information and tweak things here and there. But at the same time, we have a copy editor at the end of the day who comes in and is not only looking for grammar and grammatical errors, but looking for spelling mistakes and looking for things that might not seem right and that might not add up. Fortunately, we haven't had that experience yet where someone's fabricating things, but we're doing, we have a very, very kind of, critical eye and due diligence when it comes to, going through these things. The photo editor, Tara Israel, someone who's been with us, for a long time, probably about 1.5 years, almost 2 years at this point, who, fantastic photographer, and every single photo that goes on the site is edited in some way, whether it's a simple kind of color correction or, sifting through these 100 photos that a photographer might file with us and finding the best ones. She's pretty vital to the operation because, she's sort of handling the whole visual side, at least when it comes to photography. When it comes to multimedia, that's something that, at least at this point, I'm still kind of managing myself because I'm the one of sort of the duo of the 2 main editors that has multimedia experience as well. But, as we grow, we're getting people on board who are more multimedia savvy and can kind of hopefully take ownership over that element of the business too.
We wanted to know a bit more about where publishing industry is headed, right?
Yes. If I can I think, well, you did describe yourself as being a bit of a nerd for this stuff, and you have been involved in writing and publishing and this stuff for a long time. So we're kind of interested in what you see as like the most exciting movement that media is taking at the moment, or where it might kind of go in terms of its evolution.
Yeah, so I think, despite sort of, maybe some of the kind of decline in journalism things you might hear, I personally think this is the most exciting time we've had so far when it comes to media and journalism and storytelling. I mean, for starters, everyone nowadays is a storyteller, right? I mean, you have a Twitter handle, that's an outlet. I mean, and 140 characters at a time, but you're telling stories. The taco, whatever, Cool Ranch tacos, the guy mentioned before, that's a story, right? And Taco Bell's crafting a story. BMW has a magazine these days. So, there's so many stories out there, and nowadays, one of the sexiest jobs to have in media is the director of content for, and a lot of times you hear those titles coming out of places that aren't really even in content companies. My fiance, for instance, is kind of heading up content for an e-commerce initiative at McLaren, which makes baby strollers. And so it's an interesting kind of intersection of editorial and advertising we're seeing and marketing, and I think people are learning as they've known for a while, of course, but I think really right now they're kind of capitalizing and really investing in content as a means to draw, whether it's traffic or sales of your strollers or whatever it is. I think when you're talking about journalism specifically, I think there has been a push kind of away from this 24/7 constant news cycle. A couple of really big successful media outlets have come out in recent years, Salon.com, for instance, Forbes magazine, and saying we're publishing less often but higher quality content and sometimes longer pieces, and we're seeing results of, because of that. We're seeing higher traffic numbers and higher engagement. So I think you'll continue to see startups like Narratively, maybe not doing the exact same thing we're doing, but one of the cool kind of experiences I've had so far, since we launched, was I've been approached by people from other countries who say, hey, we have something that's somewhat like-minded in Sao Paulo or in Berlin. We should Skype, or I'm coming to New York, let's talk. And that's really cool to kind of be able to be a support system for other people in other places who kind of have a similar emphasis on the craft. And yeah, so that's kind of in a nutshell, what I think is happening. I think it's a really exciting time, and at the same time, because there's so much out there, that there are challenges for people like us who are smaller when you want to be heard and be known and develop a following, because there's a lot of eyeballs you're competing for, and a lot of people's time is very precious, and perhaps more precious today than it's ever been before. Yeah. Hi, Linda.
I'm just wondering if you could talk about how you started. Like, what was day one like? Like,
Yeah.
how did you assemble the enthusiasm and then the group of people to work with?
Yeah. Well, I think day one, you can probably consider day one that night in my bed when I picked up my journal at 4 in the morning and I had this idea for this platform that would be devoted to human interest stories, and it would be in New York and then expand. And so I started kind of jotting, literally spent 4 hours at night kind of sketching out what this thing might look like. You know, to give you an idea of how long these things take, that was probably late 2008, and I didn't launch narratively until, you know, late 2012. But I think, you know, I'd been developing it on my own for a long time. It's something I cared about and perhaps cared about too much because I waited, you know, maybe time worked out well that now there's sort of a shift in media that I just referred to where kind of the stars aligned and it ended up perhaps being the perfect time to do it. But it took a long time, not least because I was having, you know, full-time jobs and trying to, you know, make a living along the way. But it got to a point where, you know, 2010 rolls around. I'd been working for some established outlets, had gotten, you know, some good experience. I thought I had the ability to finally do something. So I basically at that point, I think like many entrepreneurs might do, I identified a couple people that I thought could, you know, at least be good support systems, if not maybe even help me launch this thing. Again, I'd been developing on my own for a couple of years at that point, but I realized I couldn't do this on my own. I needed to have people, if even just for moral support, and to kind of be there and tell me when it was a bad idea or a good idea. So I approached our managing editor, Brendan, as well as a couple other people, and we started meeting over, you know, kind of, it sounds almost like one of those cliche kind of entrepreneurship tales, but really we met over beers at bars in Brooklyn, occasionally Manhattan when we were dragged out here, but, you know, and over the course of a year and a half, 2 years, we'd meet at you know, Wednesday nights and just kind of really just kind of hash out this thing. What would this look like? And those meetings over beers grew from 2 people to 6 people to 8 people to 20 people. Now we're actually meeting at the CUNY Grad School of Journalism every other Wednesday because we've outgrown all the bars in New York. So it's not quite that same sort of casual, you know, environment, but we try to keep it casual. I bring pizzas, and I actually got in trouble for bringing beer in a couple of weeks ago. So if you go to CUNY ever, don't bring beer inside unless you get prior permission. I thought I had gotten that. Another story. But you know, the point is that, you know, we had these people, you know, telling friends of friends and their friends and kind of getting involved. Of course, not all of them are still involved now, you know, 2 or so years later. That's one of the challenges of doing this is that we get emails and you know, contacts all the time from people saying, I want to be involved, I want to do this, I want to help you with marketing. But then at the end of the day, we're not able to pay them that well for it yet, so they end up finding a full-time job somewhere, which is totally understandable. So it's just one of kind of the catch-22s of doing what we're doing. We need all this help, but until we get to a point where we're generating revenue and able to pay people well, you know, it's going to be kind of a tenuous, you know, existence. But we do have a couple of really promising things right now in the works with the business model, and hopefully some exciting news in the coming weeks. So. Yeah.
Now, all of the topics you presented were presented very politically neutral. And even when you mentioned the story about the island and people not being able to go on it, do you dig into who and why they do not get on, and what politicians? In some ways, you're like a local free newspaper, you know, the Village Voice, without the politics.
Yeah, that's.
And without the agitation. But I can see that your stories will sell all kinds of things. You'll get people, you'll get sponsors, because you have no viewpoint as far as left, right, politically, ecology, and so forth. Do you specifically avoid the political?
No, it's a very astute observation. You know, I think, well, for starters, it's pretty easy to avoid politics when we're talking about clockmakers and things like that. You know, we're not necessarily all the time, at least, delving into these really complex and complicated issues. That said, you know, the assisted suicide piece, for instance, that's a very polarizing story. And I think, like any good journalist, you know, we're always trying to tell both sides of a story. And so, you know, like any piece, we're getting, you know, both sides. You know, are there cases where maybe we're getting more than one side than the other? Sure. You know, you're not going to count the words and see how much of one side you're giving versus the other. But I think we do, you know, approach everything with kind of that you know, kind of careful balance in mind. At the same time, you know, much of what we do, or a good percentage, are these kind of personal essays. You know, a lot of stories have the first person in them because the writer's a part of the story too, or the filmmaker, you're a part of that story, and it would be sort of almost disingenuous to not, you know, if you really are impacted that much, you need to tell your own side. And so, you know, maybe while we're not getting to politics, you know, we did a you know, somewhat controversial piece a few weeks ago where we posted a kind of a personal essay for this. We did a series of essays called My First Time, and people's first times doing XYZ. And we had one guy write a piece about, beautifully written about his first experience scoring heroin in New York City. And, a lot of people wrote in saying, this is fantastic, thank you for kind of putting this out there, now we know what it's like. Other people, some drug addicts actually said, that's not, why would you do this? You're kind of, condoning this horrible thing. And just because this one guy didn't get addicted to it and could do it at his whim doesn't mean we're all like that. And, so while we're not doing kind of political things left or right, we're not shying away from a controversy, I should say.
That brings up a good point, though, about where do we find the readers' feedback in your platform?
Yeah, so this week we have a new blog up that's it's called The Park Bench. Perhaps the cheesy metaphor for the place where stories are shared and observed, around any city, anywhere. This Park Bench started as kind of a fixed item on the site. So every Friday we would curate user opinions and essays and sometimes go behind the scenes via author interviews and things like that. We realized that no one really who has a sane mind is going to really want to read a big story on a Monday and wait around 4 days to kind of see what the behind the scenes thing is. So we roll out the blog now, where the blog's always there, and we're constantly putting things on it that are curated thoughts from our readers. Sometimes if there's a really interesting conversation that unfolded on Facebook or something, we'll kind of post excerpts from that there. A lot of times our readers are now writing for us. People write in and say, hey, I love what you're doing. I'm a writer, I've written for X, Y, and Z. Do you take submissions? And we'll get them involved that way. And we're always looking for new ways. One thing we're doing, we're in the process now of building out is kind of a narratively narrators platform, where any given week, one person who's part of our community can kind of be a narrator and really, take to social media or our blog or their own blog or wherever and shape a conversation around a certain story or an idea. So we're always looking for ways to kind of get, our audience involved, because, we're doing complicated, big, in-depth pieces, and it would be a shame to not kind of leverage all that interest and get people involved in a real setting for a live event or in a discussion forum on the website or so forth.
So one way a lot of blogs like to say all, make some money is doing sponsored stories.
Yeah.
But since you guys only have a couple a week, would you ever do like a sponsored story for a day, or is there a way you could work that
Yeah.
into what you're doing?
I'm glad you asked that question, because we are actually testing something sort of similar to that as part of the business model. And I probably didn't get into that when I was mentioning that before, but I did get into sort of the agency model, where we're producing possibly content for other people. And I think likewise we can produce content for them and then distribute it through our own website, provided of course that we're labeling this as kind of a sponsored piece. We certainly don't want to blur that line at all between business and editorial. So one way to do that is we're talking to various sponsors that might want to kind of sponsor a whole week. Let's say we do, another week on food or something. We get someone like Seamless Web to sponsor that week, presented by Seamless. And of course, we would still maintain editorial integrity over those pieces, but it would be, it would be kind of co-branding, where they would present it themselves. Other side of the coin, another opportunity is to, produce, kind of a short film about Seamless. We do a day in the life of a delivery man or something. We can then post that on our blog as kind of a sponsored post, and then give it to Seamless to distribute through their own channels on their website. So there's different things we're thinking about. We've even thought about doing kind of like a sponsor page on our site, where the weekly or the monthly sponsor has a page where we can kind of curate stories that are on brand with that customer, provided that these are stories that are still kind of interesting and engaging to watch and read. I think one thing that's really interesting with the Super Bowl coming up on Sunday, we've reached a new era now where back in the day, the only ads people talked about were Super Bowl ads. Ads that people spent $5 million on, or however many more dollars on, and then the New York Times TV critic was writing about the next day. Now it's changed where content, like I was mentioning earlier, is a commodity. Content is king, is kind of a saying you hear all the time. And we've reached a point now where people sometimes don't even seem to care about whether this is technically an ad or a kind of an editorial piece. Someone sent me a link a few weeks ago. check this out, this is really beautiful. And it wasn't until 2 minutes in that I realized it was actually technically an ad for a custom art frame shop in Cleveland or something. But it was really beautifully done with that whole kind of, Canon 5D, aesthetic with, a shallow depth of field, and it was beautiful. And, it was a piece of content worth sharing. So I think that's starting to change now, where people are actually sharing these things, and they're not really caring what the source is.
Do you accept an ad from Scientology?
Would I accept an ad from?
Atlantic?
That's we actually know we've started in recent weeks, partnering with some different brands and doing kind of a week of sponsorship. So we've worked with a couple so far. Actually, a cool app called Spun, which is kind of like Flipboard for those who know that. They curate kind of local content, and so they took out a kind of a week-long ad on the site. And we're not doing ads in kind of a typical sense. We're not doing huge banner ads on the site and things like that. We're trying to kind of integrate more subtly, sort of a logo and say, sponsored by or presented. Are there advertisers that wouldn't? Of course. I obviously in a dream world, our advertisers would all be people like SVA and cool kind of arts. We should talk about that, by the way. Cool arts organizations. But would we take out an ad from like ExxonMobil? I don't know. If we did a week about that was relevant to them, maybe. I'm not going to turn anybody down necessarily, but we obviously
You would take an ad from Scientology.
If it was relevant, if it seemed relevant to a week we're doing on, obscure religions or something, hey.
Let's take another question.
Yeah, you mentioned that you were doing a series of Sandy stories.
Yeah.
And for most media outlets, interest is definitely faded. So how do you plan on marketing it and enticing your readers to read your stories?
Yeah, I think so. It's a good point you hit on that. While certain media outlets maybe have stopped covering it every day, maybe the interest has waned too in the public, and people want to hear these stories. I think everything from kind of working with local blogs. Our stories, for instance, are covering. We have a story from the Rockaways, one from Staten Island, one from. I think a couple, one or two from Brooklyn. So we're trying to diversify in terms of, that's one thing, we always diversify where the stories are. Any given week, we don't want to have 5 stories about Williamsburg. We don't really want to have any stories about Williamsburg because, everyone talks about Williamsburg. The exception was a couple weeks ago where we did a story on kind of the south side where there's kind of this weird friction between the Dominican community and the kind of hipsters in Williamsburg. But, I think working with local bloggers and helping kind of to get the word out in those communities about the stories. We're actually, I don't know if I'm really at liberty to say yet, we're working with possibly a book publisher about turning these stories into a book, which has a really cool cause, which I can maybe talk about at some point down the road. So there's different ways, an ebook, putting these things together and creating a special collection. Curating other stories. We're not the only ones now, obviously, left doing Sandy stories. A lot of people are. So maybe curating relevant stories that are out there about these communities we're covering. And so there's lots of ways to do it. And I think our core community will come back, just like they do every day, and see the stories. And so I think with an event like Sandy, and this kind of covers, there's new opportunities now to kind of reach new people, which we couldn't necessarily with a week about the waterways of New York.
So the Sandy features meant like 3 or 4 months at a time.
Yeah.
You give the time you want to see. Is that a typical cycle, 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, it depends on the stories. We often try, whenever possible, to work at least kind of 2 months ahead. That's not to say we haven't scrambled on some Thursdays where we're missing one story's fallen through for the following week, and so we'll figure things out. But we're typically trying, because these stories aren't really tied to a certain news event. They don't necessarily have a kind of a short shelf life. So we're often trying to work as far in advance as possible. The caveat to that is when people are working in advance on something, it takes a lot of time and resources. The stories we're doing, these are complicated, 6,000 word stories. These are long pieces or long multimedia pieces that take a lot of work. And so, my goal is to really get to a point where I can be paying our contributors as much as they deserve as soon as possible.
Question. What do you guys think about the paid content? Like a paywall in front of a story?
Yeah, it's definitely something we've thought about a lot. Up until about a year ago, we had seriously thought about launching with a paywall even. And I kind of had this epiphany where I think I was on the treadmill at the gym next to Brendan, my managing editor, and I said, wait a minute, we're talking about this paywall, but if we had a paywall and this wasn't my site and I stumbled upon it, this is the stories I love to do, but I probably wouldn't even pay because there's so much else out there that's for free. So I was like, okay, that's, I probably can't charge anybody else if that's the case. Now, fast forward, I think we've launched. The important thing for us is to kind of, refine our voice in the product and build the audience. Moving forward, I think obviously the New York Times is the New York Times, and they can do pretty much, a lot of things that other people couldn't do. But one thing they've succeeded at is kind of doing this sort of purposely porous paywall where you're allowed, I think at this point, 10 free articles a month, and then unlimited articles if you come in via link on social media. I think that's very intriguing to me because, if we did something similar, we have this core audience that's coming back every day. I've had people email me and say, hey, I missed you guys on Kickstarter. I want to support you. How can I do that? And so I think people we get a good response, I think, in that regard. And then the people that kind of come in from referrals, which we get a lot of, we get syndicated by Huffington Post and by Salon and a lot of other big outlets. But those are people that come to our site, twice a month. So, we wouldn't lose them either. So I think, that's something that I want to kind of research a bit and figure out. But it's definitely a viable option, at least at this point.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you measure the success of a story or of a particular theme and how you track user engagement.
Yeah.
And whether that informs content decisions that you make down the line.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I guess the short of it is that, at least at this point, we don't try to let a response to a story dictate what kind of coverage we do down the road. And actually, if you look at some of our stories that have been most popular, and I say most popular in terms of page views, in terms of likes on Facebook, in terms of just kind of general traffic to those stories, it's really run the gamut. We had one piece that actually took our website down for a minute, 3 months ago. That was called "Lost in Space," and it was by a guy named Mike Alba, who's written for the New Yorker and a lot of top outlets. And I think the subtitle of the story was something like, what I learned throughout my decade of finding sex and love in cyberspace. So it was basically a story about kind of a gay male in New York's experience, trying to find love on the web. And so it had all the ingredients for med success. It had sex, it had homosexuality, it had the internet, online dating, whatever. But then we had another story that was huge, probably our second biggest story of all time, last week. That was about kind of the real story of gentrification in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, kind of who were the real players pulling the strings behind the scenes. And that story was, I think in part because Crown Heights now is sort of the new Williamsburg in a sense, the new frontier for development. So there's a lot of interest in it, but that story got a ton of traffic. We did a story on rebellious Hasidic Jews that are kind of leaving the fray and going and dating women and drinking and smoking and cavorting, and that piece was huge. So it's hard to really pinpoint a story that really does well. I guess at the end of the day, it's the stories that have done well are the ones that are very, very original. I like to think all our stories are original, but obviously there's some of them that are like, wow, this story. Who knew this existed? Who knew this person was even out there?
To your question, I imagine you're also curious that it's not the same as normal traffic watching in sense it's not just one click, is it? It's 6,000 words. How do you tell them that they
Yeah, so we can. So we're using a product now called Chartbeat. It's one of these kind of real-time analytics engines. I'm sure there are other things like it out there. We also use Google Analytics just kind of to kind of quantify and look at engagement throughout the site. But Chartbeat allows you to click on a story and see kind of in real time how far people are scrolling down. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everyone's reading the end of the story because they're not. It's a much smaller percentage than I'd like to admit that reads to the very end. It's still, when you add up the numbers though, and you see 30% of people reading the end, and just throwing that out there, of 100,000 people, that's a lot. It's still a lot of people. But it depends on the story. I think a lot of times our traffic at this point, since we're early on, is sometimes muddled because we're getting referrals from other people, which is great because it helps to boost the numbers a bit, but these aren't necessarily our core demographic that's going to stick around on the site and spend, an hour of their day looking at other stories. When you look at kind of the core group of people we have, our sort of non-bounce visitors, people that come and kind of stay on the site for a while, the numbers are staggering. They're staying on the site for 10, 15, 20 minutes in some cases, which is very high.
Will the narrative always live on the online, or will it have another form? For example, this is another form you've been here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think really we want to be able to reach you in whatever way you want to be reached, and so I think the important thing for us is to be able to tell these stories in a variety of ways, whether that's the ebooks we're putting out now, whether it's sort of the mobile responsive website we have and allowing you to kind of read our stories on your smartphone or your cell phone. It sounds very analog at this point and almost backward thinking, but I do like the idea of kind of a really beautifully bound print product at some point, a kind of a collector's edition we could put out once a quarter or something like that. The live events, collaborations with production studios. I think really the sky's the limit. It's just a matter of having enough people on staff and hours in the day and of course the revenue to pursue these things. It's always very tough for me to remember these things. So much going on. Next week is actually the Sandy stories. Yeah, so it's kind of, I think the working title at least, which may well be the title, is 100 Days Later. Kind of looking at Sandy 100 days, relatively 100 days after the fact.
It's the same approach to design journalism, quite honestly. Coming back after the initial views.
Yeah.
So I think that now would be a good time for us to take the conversation into the other room. So I would like to invite you all to join us for a drink next door. But first, before we get up, I'd like you to join me in with another big round of applause for Noah.